Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I am thrilled to be joined once again by broadcaster, comedian, writer, author, satirist, all-round nice guy, Andrew Doyle. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It seems that every time I speak to you, there's a new bow, new string to your bow, rather, and a bow, an extra bow. So I don't think we've actually spoke since you became had a regular slot on GB News. That's been a while,
could be right,
hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's been a couple of years. So that would be. I've been at GB News for a year and a bit, basically. So yeah, lots changed in the last year.
And how are you finding it deep in the belly of right-wing fascism over there?
I have been fascinated by the hysteria around GB News. That has been something that I don't think anyone really anticipated. 4 or so months before we launched, there were these groups of activists sort of saying that this was going to be a far-right echo chamber, groups like Stop Funding Hate and all these sorts of strange people. And they decided what they thought it would be. And there were even articles with big photographs of people who were never ever going to be on the channel. They just sort of decided what it must be. And then of course it aired, and it wasn't that. And they still stuck to their fantasy, and that was bizarre. They held fast to this fantasy they decided on months ago, and they still are today. So they still say, I mean, even though GB News has a range of opinions, always makes an effort to see both sides and get voices on from both sides. They still say it's a far right echo chamber. It's incredible. What do they call it? Belief perseverance. When the evidence is right in front of you to undermine what you thought you knew, but you still hold fast to that belief. I mean, it's a fascinating insight into human nature.
Yeah, but I think the problem is these people go in too hard. They're too invested. And when it's proven demonstrably false, it's kind of like, how do you climb down from there without looking like a right clown? I mean, it's a mixed bag, GB News. It's similar to the kind of criticism you got for writing for Spiked. I suppose it's a collection of different people from political spheres, etc. So yeah, I'm now part of the Spiked Writers Fascist Club as well. So I can't even say anything.
Well, welcome to that club, because you'll get quite a bit of flack for that. I mean, it's a similar thing though. Whereas the only major difference, I suppose, is Spike does have a broad editorial line. Although columnists tend to disagree with each other on various things, there's kind of a broad thing about freedom, about humanity being underrated, and about liberty and free speech. And of course, when it comes to GB News, you hear every opinion all over the place, and it's. I think it's just because they maybe have flicked on and they see a show or a presenter they don't like, and so they assume that's. But that's the same with every channel. If it's an Ofcom regulated channel, so if you think we're going to be, calling for genocide or something, I mean, people are seriously saying stuff like that. It's dangerous and hateful. There has never been anything hateful on the channel. It's weird that they, like I say, cling to the fantasies.
I was just saying to you before we started, I love the new book titled The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World. So, I mean, given that I love it, it's going to make this conversation less awkward, isn't it?
I mean, it would have been awkward if you hated it.
Yeah.
that would be a tense hour.
It would, wouldn't it? We'd have to talk about something else.
Yeah.
But I am truly grateful for it, because I used to spend a lot of my time, most of my time, in fact, going for fundamentalist religion. And then when this new ideology reared its head, I picked up on them themes pretty quick. And a lot of people who'd been following my work for a while had sort of thought it was a deviation, and it was very difficult to explain to some of them that it's basically a continuation, going for dogmas, tribe mentality, blasphemy codes, things like that. But a few people would say, how can you call it a religion? I mean, first of all, describe this new ideology we're speaking about in the best possible way. It's been referred as far left, progressive, woke, etc. And then how can we possibly label it a religion when there's no sort of God in the sense that a monotheism would have?
Well, there have been lots of people who have argued that social justice, or what we call social justice, maybe the woke or critical social justice, is a form of religion in an authentic sense rather than merely as an analogy. People like Vivek Ramaswamy John McWhorter, James Lindsay, and I'm using it more in terms of an analogy by which we might fully comprehend it, because I think it has all the hallmarks of a religious movement. You know, people can see that there's all these very powerful ideologues in positions of clout in society, and that they are doing all this kind of damage, and that they brook no dissent, and they have a very specific sense of what you must believe, and they will police that through what we now call cancel culture. And they can see all of these things, and they excommunicate those who step slightly out of line, and they brand people as heretics, effectively. You even had that case with the protest outside of Netflix around Dave Chappelle, where someone was shouting at one of the protesters to repent, saying, "Repent, motherfucker." So even using the language of religion themselves, but by framing it in those terms, it makes it accessible. And I think that's why I wrote the book, because above all, I think the reason why the New Puritans are winning is because people don't understand them. It's because they use progressive-sounding language to describe themselves. Things like progressive, when they're not, they're regressive. They talk about social justice, which sounds brilliant. They talk about anti-racism, which sounds brilliant because we're all opposed to racism. They talk about equity, which is a bit of a fudge because most people think they're talking about equality, and they're not. They're talking about something different. But you know, they use all these ideas, these phrases. They call themselves left-wing, even though I don't think they are. And so people go along with it. Decent people think, oh, well, I'm for all those things. I'm for equality. I'm against racism, so I'll go along with it. But then they've also started to notice that actually it's weird, because the outcomes of this movement aren't that. The outcomes are creating more racial division. You know, even outcomes such as the mutilation of children because of the extremities of gender identity ideology. So all of this sort of stuff is now starting to make people nervous, but they still don't understand it. If they see it as a religion, then it makes sense, because as Steven Weinberg, the physicist, said, you know, in a world where you had good and bad, you have good people doing good things and bad people having bad things, but for good people to do bad things, that takes religion. And that's the same with any ideology, isn't it? But once you see it in those terms, once you see the chief proponents of this movement as high priests setting down their edicts and their decrees, once you see it in those terms, it really does start to make sense and clarify. And I think that's why I've done it that way. But I'm not saying it's a religion in a literal sense.
Perfect answer, yeah. Might be worth a quick digression on Titania McGrath now. You're the brains behind that excellent piece of satire in book form, Twitter form, and for a while you were doing remarkably well predicting the future with that account. You'd think of some absurd, excessively woke claim about culture or society and put it out there, and life truly does imitate art in that sense. And I suppose my question would be, is this ideology in regards to satire, does it make it easy to satirize, or is it harder to satirize because it is so absurd? Well,
that's a good question. I mean, a lot of people think that things have gone beyond satire now, because, you know, when you read these stories, they do seem so self-satirizing, don't they? You know, when they're talking about how, you know, fire engines are racist, or, you know, cheese is homophobic, or whatever it might be. And you just think, you know, it's so silly, so stupid. But actually, you know, they believe it. And, you know, if you'd have made a joke, say, 10 years ago about there's a major invasion, you know, Russia invades Ukraine, and on that morning, the Ministry of Defense puts out a tweet saying, we're having a really great LGBTQ coffee morning where we're talking about pansexuality. Yeah. And then on the same day, you also have a front cover of the Daily Mail talking about how MI5 and MI6 are urging their spies to reconcile with their white privilege.
Putin must be shitting himself.
But it sounds like the stuff of fiction, doesn't it? And I think if you'd have made that kind of joke about 10, 15 years ago, the sort of thing you would have seen on Brass Eye, you know, you would have thought, well, it's funny, but it's obviously never going to happen. And we're in that world now. And I think we've kind of not noticed that seismic shift in a way. We've just been kind of carried along on this tide. You know, all of the stuff that we now take for granted. You know, the fact that the police are routinely investigating non-crime, you know, the fact that there are NHS clinics who are effectively fixing gay children through sterilisation and medicalisation. You know, the fact that we have a broad movement calling for censorship. The fact that you now watch comedy shows on TV and scenes have been taken out because people at the BBC think you shouldn't watch certain scenes. You know, the fact that there was a school board in charge of 30 schools in Canada that has removed thousands of books from school library shelves and burnt some of them and called it a flame purification ceremony in the name of progress. All of this stuff, if you'd have said that to us 10 years ago, this is going to happen in 10 years' time, you'd have said, don't be ridiculous. That cannot happen in a sane society, in a liberal society. None of those things can happen. People can't be arrested for quoting rap lyrics. You know, people aren't going to be arrested for posting memes online. People aren't going to be teaching children that there are 100 different genders. You'd never have believed it. And what worries me now is that we're so in it now. We just sort of accept it. You know, there was that TV show on BBC that talked about where a young child is being told about how there's hundreds of genders, and we just sort of now think, oh, we shrug, don't we? And we say, well, that's you know, that's the world we're in. Let's just ignore that. My point that I'm making in the book, hopefully quite clearly, is we can't ignore that, because for every flippant, stupid story about Mr. Potato Head becoming gender neutral, which sure we can make fun of, and you know is probably best ignored, it is symptomatic of a much broader problem, huge problem. You can't ignore it when the Ministry of Defence, when the police, when the NHS, when the government, when the civil service are all in thrall to this kind of stuff. You can't ignore that, because those are the wheels of power. So it's funny while it's a few students on university campus who are a bit overzealous. It's funny when it's just a few things like that, a few activists online screaming their nonsense into the ether. It's not funny when the leader of the opposition is asked to define a woman and cannot do so because he's too terrified to say what we all know to be true. That's no longer funny. Well, it is funny, but there's a really dark element to that.
Yeah, it's almost out of dystopian fiction, isn't it, I suppose? And I suppose keeping on this theme, because there's two things where I think, the first thing I think I was wrong about was this idea that, and you mentioned this in your book, that COVID presenting itself as a real problem for humanity may have dialed down the temperature on some of this culture war stuff. And that was a mistake. I was very naive there, and it did not, obviously. Second thing as well, I seem to think, and I certainly did several years ago, I didn't take what happened on Twitter too seriously in terms of the viciousness, the vitriol, the abuse, the kind of ideology that permeated it. Now it feels like it has spilled out into the real world. You start you start your book with an anecdote that you've actually told me in person about an individual, public figure who you'd known for quite some time, very close friend, basically screamed Nazi cunt in your face over a minor political disagreement. I'm not going to out that person now, unless you want to do it now. Give some big juice to the world.
I don't want to. I feel like it would be score settling, and I'm not interested in that sort of thing.
That is fair enough. So has Twitter spilled over into the real world now? Are we living a hashtag reality in that sense?
Well, you know, we do. I mean, I opened the book with that anecdote, partly because it was so shocking to me. So, to the extent that I had to go back. I mean, the day after it happened, I emailed a very close friend of mine to explain what happened, saying, I can't believe this happened. This is insane. And so I had to go back and just read the account I gave the day after, because I was thinking, am I misremembering this? It's so extreme. But I wasn't. It was exactly what happened. And this guy is known for being smart. And he is very, very intelligent. But what's really fascinating about this movement, and again, it helps to understand it as a religion, is even extremely smart people can succumb to it, can be completely unmoored from rationality. And that's what's happened in his case. But I use that as a personal anecdote because I think it's happened to a lot of people. I think a lot of people in this culture war have lost friends over nothing, over this fantasy world that these activists have created. So that's a real tragedy, because it's not even like in the Irish Civil War, where you had literally brothers fighting on either side of this fierce and ugly dispute, killing each other. But there was something at stake there. There was a different worldview relating to politics there that was tangible and real. And I'm not excusing the violence or anything. What I'm saying is it was rooted in something that was actually happening. The disputes and the rifts that are happening now between families and friends and colleagues and everything are based on nothing. There is nothing going on. I mean, this guy thought I was part of this Nazi, that I was a Nazi, that there are Nazis in every shadow, that we are now living in a society that is effectively a fascist society. That is not true. It is so far from the truth. And we have all the data that tells us that the far right does exist, but it is very marginal. And we know this, so that's confirmed. We just don't live in a society where racism sexism, homophobia, etc., are tolerated, at all. If you post that kind of stuff, you make yourself a pariah. You're not going to get jobs. No one's going to talk to you. You're not going to have friends, etc., unless you're part of that little marginal fringe clique, right? So, but to completely reject reality in favour of a pseudo-reality that has been promoted and concocted, frankly, by activists is a tragedy. So all of and I do wonder. I think maybe, it's already starting to happen, because I keep getting contacted by comedian people who used to be friends, then they went silent on me for a few years, saying, I see where you're coming from. I think you're right. And, I wish I could say the things you're saying, but I can't, etc. I get a lot of that. I think we all do. So there's a broad understanding that this is going on now, but we're not there yet. And I just think maybe what I'm hoping is in 10, 20, 30 years time, all of these people that after Brexit suddenly thought we were in a race, we had racists everywhere, that we were a nation of fascists, they might reflect and think, I got that very, very wrong. Just like with Salem, in the book, as you know, I open the book and close the book with the Salem witch trials, because what is interesting to me about that is it was a short burst. It was a hysteria that lasted little over a year, right? It was just in 1692 to the early part of 1693. And it was a community, a God-fearing community of New England Puritans who did not hunt witches. This was not their thing. This was a huge aberration for them. And there was a burst of hysteria. You had a group of young children, girls, screaming about that they'd seen all these various villagers with witches, with the devil, signing the devil's book, sending out their spirits to harm them, transmogrifying into yellow birds and all this kind of incredible stuff. And everyone believed it or went along with it, and people were hanged, and 20 people executed, a further 5 died in prison. And eventually, once they came to their senses, everyone basically said, yeah, we got that wrong. They really repented of it, and they knew it was wrong. And I feel it's a really useful analogy to what we're going through at the moment, particularly because all those activists online with the anime avatars and all the people doing all of that screaming and stuff, I see them as the girls. Because the girls of Salem, insofar as they might be experiencing.
I thought you were just throwing down a sexist insult then. Bunch of girls.
Yeah, these girls. No, I see them as equivalent to the girls in Salem because they are caught up in a hysteria. I think a lot of them believe it. And I think a lot of them are seeing witches everywhere. I think they really are. I think there are also a contingent that are lying and are enjoying the capacity to bully people, and that would have been the same in Salem. A lot of the girls will have been experiencing these visions and these fantasies. There will be some who will be using it for vengeful purposes because they knew that they could point the finger at someone and get them executed. So there's that interesting comparison. But the only reason anything happened is because the elites supported the girls, right? That's the only reason anything. Because if the magistrates and the ministers had said, "You're not telling the truth," it would have ended overnight, and they didn't. They went along with it. Similarly today, the screaming activists are making so much noise and making such shrill and incredible demands, that people must be fired if they claim there are biological sex differences, that people must be hounded out of their work, and the elites are going along with it. The politicians aren't answering the question, what is a woman, right? So it is a very interesting parallel. And similarly, in Salem, the more I read about Salem, the more I realized a lot of those in power didn't really believe it. But they were worried because they could be the next to be accused. Things like when the girls accused the colony's the governor of the colony's wife, nothing happened. The magistrate said, no, you've made a mistake. So even they knew that it wasn't real. But they went along with it. And so today, and I think that's our way out, let the girls scream witch. Let them scream about the witches and everything. Let the anime activists scream about how there are a million genders. But as long as the elites, the magistrates in Salem or the politicians today, just stand up against it and say, no, we're not going to tolerate it, they will go away. You must have noticed this. Whenever people actually take a stand against the shrill demands of these activists, they back down. Because actually, their power lies in the hold they have over those in authority. That's where it comes from. Their power lies in the fact that if they phone the police and say, I've been the victim of a hate crime because someone said there are 2 sexes and I feel that's a transphobic attack, they know the police will go out and investigate and possibly arrest that person. They know that. They've got this armed wing of the state on their side. They know that if they It just takes a couple of tweets before someone gets fired from their job. I list loads of examples of where this has happened in the book. And it's only a few tweets. That's all it takes. I mean, a friend of mine, Mary Burke, who was performing at a comedy club in Brighton, or set to perform, one that I've performed in many times. It took 2 or 3 emails from activists to the promoter saying, she makes us feel unsafe because of her jokes. And they pulled the gig. And that, it's a thing. It actually happens. They have the power. They are the screaming girls of Salem crying witch, and people are going along with it. Well, it's about time we stop that. It's about time the people in power said, no, you don't get your way. We're not going to give you this kind of power for the fantasies that you are perpetuating. That's my hope, anyway.
That's a great answer. Yeah, there's this feeling, isn't there, that we've reached a point in history now where we've got over all our tribal differences and we can't possibly make the same mistakes of the past. And people really need to keep that in their perspective, I think. You've just reminded me of something there talking about comedy, actually, because you very lovingly describe Edinburgh Fringe Festival in your latest book. And I can't help but feel that had it been published a bit later, you would have included the recent controversy surrounding Jerry Sadowitz. Now, he's a complete unknown entity to me. You're well more informed in regards to his acts, his persona, etc. I just want to get your thoughts on that now, in terms of what happened and what the ramifications of something like that are.
I mean, you mentioned that. It's very frustrating, isn't it? Because, of course, the book was finished a number of months ago, and lots of things keep happening. And I think,
but this would be true. I mean, you could be publishing this in 2050 maybe, and I think you'd still be like, oh shit, something big's just happened. Yeah,
exactly. So, but that's fine, because I think I've got enough examples in the book. There are so many.
It is very expansive. I will give you that.
Yeah. But I think with Jerry Sadowitz, so a lot of people don't know. I mean, I've seen Jerry Sadowitz many times over many years. His act hasn't changed. Well, I mean, he writes new material all the time, but what I mean is the fundamental, his persona hasn't changed. And what he does, he is the most offensive act in the world, I would imagine. He's certainly the most controversial comedian I've ever seen. And he's a magician. He's a big frizzy-haired, almost psychotic, monstrous Scottish character who, well, he is Scottish. And what he does is he performs these magic tricks on stage, but throughout he's screaming this bile about everyone, about minorities, about women and gays and black people and everyone you can think that you mustn't go for. Jewish people, he's Jewish himself, but it doesn't matter. He goes for them as well, everyone. And it is like a cathartic experience. It's an explosion of hate. It's a persona, but it's also this weird juxtaposition. He's one of the best magicians in the country. So you've got this weird sort of anger and rage, and he's doing these incredible sleight of hand tricks.
Like a Nazi Paul Daniels.
Yeah, exactly. And, he's unquotable, by the way. I mean, I can think of some of his lines now. If I quoted them now, I think you'd probably get deboosted. It's proper. But the thing is, at no point do you come away thinking, oh, I want to be like him. I want to have those views. It is hilarious. And it is precisely hilarious because that persona is, there's always going to be a moment in a Jerry Sadowitz show where you think that's just way too, I can't cope with that. That's too much.
Didn't he get his cock out though? Isn't that the issue?
He does that all the time. No, that's part of his persona. He's psychotic. So I mean, one of the shows I saw that he did a few years ago was called Jerry Sadowitz, Comedian, Magician, Psychopath.
Right.
A psychopath would get his cock out just to piss you off, while he's pulling doves out of his sleeve. But this is the thing. You have to see it as a theatrical persona, a theatrical performance. The idea that he is going out there to say literally what he thinks is so comedy illiterate. I don't even know. It's just illiterate, full stop. Nudity at the Edinburgh Fringe is normal. You see penises all the time, right? It's called the Fringe. You're going to get the more extreme shows, right? And there's warnings all over his flyers. No one goes to see Jerry Sadowitz not knowing what they're letting themselves in for. The show was called Not For Anyone. He did a promo video beforehand saying, I'm going to be rude, I'm going to get my cock out, I'm going to do that. Like, it's all out there. You are not in any position to complain that you thought you were going to see, a group of women knitting. It's very, very clear what's going on there. I mean, one show I saw him do in London, he came out with a sheet over his hand, like he's going to do a magical reveal of something. And he kept sort of preparing it and saying, right, I'm going to pull this off now. But he had to keep stopping himself because he just thought of, oh, the fucking gays. No, this is why I hate the gays. And and then he went back to the trick and he was like, no, and what about the fucking women, bitches and all this? And then he went back to it. And I promise you, it took him over an hour before he pulled it off. And there was nothing there.
Brilliant.
But it was just this sort of insanity encapsulated in a comedic persona. And it is fantastic. And he is fantastically talented. And for the Pleasance is one of the big 4 venues at Edinburgh. And they not only cancelled the run, well, he only had 2 shows, but it's a massive venue and it was sold out, right? So that's a big loss. They cancelled one of those shows, half of his run, I suppose. And they issued a statement saying that his material did not align with their values. I thought their values was to provide venues for artists to do whatever they wanted, to make their own artistic decisions, but apparently not. And also,
because they actually in the statement, sorry, Andrew, they actually referenced directly his opinions, didn't they? They didn't mention anything about the public nudity, so they're literally making a statement about what has been said as being unacceptable, which is very, very strange. Yeah,
I don't know what his opinions are. He wasn't telling opinions; he was telling jokes.
Yeah, it was not a lecture, was it?
If the Pleasance, who's meant to be one of the biggest comedy venues in the country, if the Pleasance don't know what a joke is, if the Pleasance don't know the difference between a joke and an opinion, they need to get out of that industry. Just stage lectures by politicians, if that's all you can do. If you have no understanding of the creative arts, don't get into the creative arts. It's pretty simple. You're not qualified to do it. I mean, they actually even said that members of the audience felt unsafe. They even used the lexicon of critical social justice there. And what's really annoying about it is, where were the big comics? Like a few people said that they supported Sadowitz and this shouldn't happen. One of the co-owners of the Assembly Rooms, which is another venue, came out and said the Pleasance should get stuffed. We don't do this sort of thing, which is great. That was really good of him to do that. But on the whole, some of those big names, they were deathly quiet. And the comedy industry is in a terrible, terrible state. It has been completely ideologically captured. Some of the most innovative acts never get anywhere. It rewards blandness. It rewards mediocrity. It will give literally awards. There will be awards in Edinburgh that are given to people who are very second-rate comics, but they promote the right message. So the industry is pretty much done. Like, so if you are seriously an innovative, interesting, young, up-and-coming comic, the best way is to circumvent the industry and go online, frankly, at this stage, until things get fixed. It doesn't mean anything. An award at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival no longer means you've got the best show. It means you've got the show that is ideologically in line with what the industry wants, and that's boring. And I suppose that I know that's been the case in the Oscars for a long time as well, but it's more palpable now and it's more intense. At least up until a few years ago, you would get some. And look, there are some talented people being nominated and everything. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is there's a lot of dross in there too. I've even seen, and particularly because comedy critics are very much ideologically captured, most of them. So you'll even see, I remember there's one particularly, he's not really a comedy critic, he's a propagandist for the identitarian left, but he thinks he's a critic. And he writes for The Guardian, and he wrote a piece about one of these very identitarian comics. And he almost admitted, well, no one was laughing, it wasn't funny, but a really good show, 4 stars, because he can't
he had the right
bring himself.
It's
like the way they go when they try and review the new Morrissey album, and there was even one for The Independent where it sort of basically acknowledged he's really good, but 2 stars because his opinions are awful. These aren't critics; they're propagandists.
Agreed. Yeah, it seems like a lot of comedians are scared of losing or not getting offered that panel show gig and playing it very safe. Unfortunately. Because we rely on comedians usually to, I hate to use this hacky term, but speak truth to power in a way. And it does feel like this ideology is the power at the moment. Right,
exactly. So that's what we should be satirising. That's what we should be mocking. But you get punished for doing so. But look, there's consolation here, I think, for young up-and-coming comics. I don't think that's the future. I don't, Mock the Week's going. Partly it's going because it's become too politically bland and everyone's saying the same stuff and no one's interested in watching it. Same will happen to Live at the Apollo because no one's really watching that anymore. The industry will shrivel and die, and actually there's so many opportunities online to do your own thing and you can be so much more subversive and interesting. and yes, obviously comedians are worried about money and the business of living, but it can also be lucrative to circumvent the industry and do your own thing, and much more artistically satisfying. I think if you're going to go into a creative vocation, it has to be that. It has to be a vocation, right? You have to love what you're doing. But I wouldn't love what I was doing if I was being stifled all the time. I wouldn't love what I was doing if I had to pass my scripts before a sensitivity reader before it made it to the stage. I wouldn't be satisfied with that.
No, I mean, moments ago you mentioned the critical social justice lexicon, and another word that we see thrown around a lot is gaslighting, and that almost feels appropriate to me in the way they talk to people about the culture wars, in a pretending that it doesn't exist, or that we're inventing it ourselves. And you have this wonderful phrase in your book. I think you say something like, I mean, you wouldn't want to spend all your time on this, but you feel like a weapon has been forced into your hand, in a sense.
Yeah.
So what exactly do you mean by that?
What I mean is there are more important things in life than identity politics. But I feel obliged to address this because it threatens to destabilize the liberal values upon which we have made so much progress and upon which our society depends. So it has to be addressed. I'm not comfortable with us drifting into authoritarianism. And I think, therefore, we are now, we are now all complicit. We have to be part of this, whatever this is, if you want to call it the culture war. And you become part of it just by criticizing it, I suppose. I mean, this is the big thing. I'm not a culture warrior, but I am a critic of culture warriors. And I suppose, and of course what they say is that I'm the real culture warrior. Because, they start the culture war, they fight the culture war. Someone comes along and says, actually, I'm not sure about this. And they say, why are you starting a culture war? Right, so that's the trick.
Yeah.
And it is gaslighting. But I suppose if an army attacks you and you defend yourself, you're in the battle, aren't you? At that point,
This is true.
And I think that's inevitable. But that doesn't make people like us culture warriors. It makes us critics of culture warriors. I think we're all, and that's the thing. Is like, whereas 10 years ago, and one of the criticisms I always used to get is that you can just ignore these people. That these people are just it's just a few minority. It's just a few people. But like I say, they're in power now. They have the power. They're the establishment. And I think part of a satirist's responsibility as well is to go after those in power, to criticize the establishment. And that's what I do.
For sure. And I was very pleased to see you highlight issues of class in your book and, wealth inequality, things like that. You described identity politics as a bourgeois fig leaf that often conceals the realities of economic inequality, which I think spot on. But why is it, do you think, a lot of these activists on this side completely omit the idea of class or economic situation and look at sort of group identities in terms of gender, sexuality, skin color, things like that?
Because they're mostly rich. I mean, it's that simple. I think this movement has come from the middle classes, the upper middle classes, mostly. A lot of the people who really push this stuff are independently wealthy and don't have to work. They demonize the working class. After Brexit, we saw that a lot. There was a lot of demonization of the working class being racist. The working class is hugely racially diverse.
Yes.
Right. This idea that working class people know all sorts of people from all sorts of races and backgrounds and sexualities, and that idea that there's an inherent racism to working class people is to assume or to perceive the working class as homogeneously white, which is in itself a kind of racism. And I think why would you change a system that works in your benefit, I suppose? And I don't think it's necessarily deliberate, but they or conscious in that sense. But I think a lot of these middle class activists, when you are that wealthy, when you don't have to worry about the reality of economic inequality, the reality of poverty, you can get upset about using gender neutral pronouns, and you can you can start to find other battles to fight and picking fights where there's nothing there, there's nothing of substance there. But I had some guy comment under the book earlier, or commenting on the book, saying, well, I'm on a council estate and no one around here gives a damn about pronouns or anything like that. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. And that's the point I make in the book. Of course not. Why would you? If you've got no money, if you there's a difference between these abstract matrices of oppression along the lines of identity, and systemic oppression, which is often detected where it doesn't exist, or things such. I mean, I'm not saying systemic oppression can't exist, but I'm saying oftentimes when it is detected, it isn't there. All this idea of multiple genders and stuff, that can't matter to someone who can't afford to feed their kids. That sort of stuff, because there's the reality of being poor. It's a material problem, not an abstract problem, right? And that's why I also think this woke movement is not left-wing. They call themselves left-wing, but to me it is incoherent to proclaim to be left-wing when you do not care about working class people or the realities of economic inequality. I don't think it makes sense, to be honest. But that's, I mean, you know, I talk a lot in the book about the way in which the left took the cultural turn. So it stopped focusing on money and nepotism and class and started focusing on identity. And that has been almost the death knell for the left, really, because now some of the most prominent left-wing voices in this country are not left-wing. But then that fits in exactly with this social justice movement. This is a movement that calls itself the social justice movement, but isn't interested in social justice. It calls itself anti-racist, but is making society more racist. You know, and so of course it can call itself left-wing and progressive when it is not left-wing and most definitely regressive. I mean, sometimes they even call themselves liberal, but of course they're the opposite. And it's maddening, isn't it? Because it means, and as I think I make the case quite forcefully in the book, that the culture war is really about language, about who gets to define words, who gets to control the narrative, and that's what this is about.
Yeah, I do want to pick up on that issue of controlling the language, but you've just reminded me of something. So you spend a significant amount of the book on the gay rights movement as it exists in 2022, Stonewall, things like that. And yeah. I think it's fair to say you are relatively disappointed rather with the direction it's taken. And you yourself are a gay man, but it doesn't, I mean, I've never noticed it be part of your identity. It feels like a piece of trivia to me. It only becomes relevant when it is relevant. I mean, some of your criticism in that chapter feels particularly more scathing than other chapters.
Oh, does it? That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, not in terms of vitriol, just more funny witticisms. I mean, the talk about pronoun flags, things like that. I think you make some analogy about a brawler still trying to fight when the pub's closed and things like that, which I thought was great.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering...
Well, that's interesting.
Is there a sense that a community that claims to represent people like you has let you down? Do you feel that in any way?
Yeah, of course. And this fits into what I was saying before about words meaning the opposite of what they mean. And there is something quite, I suppose, on a personal level. I mean, it's interesting that I hadn't picked up on that. But if that's the case, that chapter is particularly vitriolic, then that makes sense. Because, of course, I was a big fan of Stonewall. I was a big fan of the gay rights movement. I think what the gay rights movement achieved over those 20, 30 years in a complete sea change of societal attitudes. I mean, when I was a young kid, the idea of saying you were gay was like the worst thing you could say. The worst thing you could be. And if you would have said that at school, you would have been horribly bullied. You know, one boy who was suspected of being gay was horribly bullied for it. You know, the suspicion was enough. So the idea that we would now live... I remember I mentioned in the book where I used to work for the National Blood Service, and I remember... And I said to someone, I think we need to have gay marriage. And she laughed. She found it the most hilarious thing. And I almost couldn't convince her that I wasn't joking. But then it's just 10 years after that, 12 years after that, and everyone who doesn't support gay marriage is now considered a wrong-un, right? So and all of that was achieved through protest, yes, but also persuasion. No one in the gay rights movement ever tried to take away anyone else's rights or ever tried to police their language or say that you should be arrested unless you use the phrases that we want you to use. It wasn't done through an authoritarian method. And so I am particularly disappointed at what has happened to Stonewall and to the gay rights movement in general, because it's become an anti-gay movement. And I never, who would have thought that would happen? But Stonewall now, I mean, the head of Stonewall, Nancy Kelly, refers to lesbians who refuse to include men in their dating pool as sexual racists. That's Jesus. What homophobes used to say back in the 80s. They used to say... lesbians, they just haven't found the right guy, they just need a good dick, or horrible phrases, homophobic phrases like that. And she's now saying if you're excluding people with a penis from your dating pool, you need to re-examine yourself and examine your prejudices. It's the same as what the homophobes used to say, you know? The bullies at school used to say that if a boy was a bit girly and didn't like football and liked playing with dolls, that he was actually a girl, and they used to call him a girl. And now that's what Stonewall is saying. That's what mermaids are saying. You know, it's very likely that if you don't conform to traditional conservative gender stereotypes, you might be in the wrong body, and maybe you should be fast-tracked onto puberty blockers, and maybe we can fix you and make you heterosexual, is effectively what's going on there. So it is particularly dispiriting to me. I mean, how do we reach this point? I mean, the idea that I said before, the NHS, but also that Stonewall, supporting an ideology that tries to fix gay people in their youth. What the hell is going on there? And yeah, so this is particularly distressing to me. And I'm glad we're seeing that we've had the closure of the Tavistock clinic. That's a start. But look at the way the activists are spinning it. The activists are saying that's a victory because it means there's going to be more local gender clinics open for kids. No child should be medicalized because they fail to conform to gender stereotypes. I'm just going to put it like that. That shouldn't happen. Shouldn't be happening. It's deeply reactionary. It's reactionary and conservative. It's ultra conservative. It's based on this notion that girls have to behave in this way and boys have to behave in the other way. No, just leave kids alone.
Agreed. It's so tragic, and I just feel there are so many scandals in the post on this issue.
Oh,
we'll look
this
back
is going to be
with absolute horror. Yeah, and that is such a tragedy, and it will not be pleasurable at all to say "I told you so" on any score. I don't think.
No, I mean because kids have been mutilated.
Yeah,
I mean you see these images of girls having double mastectomies and stuff. This is not something that will be forgiven with ease, right? Even though I think a lot of the people who have perpetuated it are probably decent people, they've just been swallowed up into this mad religious cult. And when people become subsumed into cults, they do lose. It's not a malicious thing anymore. I think a lot of it, although the act is evil and although the outcome is evil, sadly, the intention can often be good, just as in the Inquisition. I'm sure a lot of those people who were torturing women on the rack or burning people at the stake thought they were doing God's work. I have no doubt that they thought that.
Yeah. Righteousness, it can be one hell of a drug, I suppose. I mean, someone who's become sort of emblematic of this whole issue really is JK Rowling, and you dedicate a large portion of your book to her and what that's been like, and it is fascinating. I think we both share a similar fascination with how she's perceived by a certain section of the discussion versus what she's actually said, and it feels very strange to have actual text of the things she said on this issue and contrast it with what people say she said. Now, to me, in reality, that's not a scenario that should exist. That should be the end of any debate, but it isn't. So What's going on here?
Well, I mean, look, politicians and ideologues have always lied, and Donald Trump has lied.
Yes.
Boris Johnson has lied. Like every major politician has tried to get away with something, right? So you will say a lie if you think you can get away with it. But what people generally haven't done much is that they've lied when the evidence that contradicts the lie is in front of your face.
Yeah.
And that's a weird sort of distinction there. Now, when these people do this, when they say the protests in Kenosha were mostly peaceful, and you can see the burning buildings behind the reporter, something different is happening there. It's not just that, because if that guy wanted, he could have done a different shot, a different angle, so you didn't see any burning buildings, and then he could have said these are mostly peaceful, and then the lie would have worked.
Yeah,
but we could see that it wasn't true. But that's different, because then we know we're expected to go along with the fantasy, and that's a hallmark of tyranny and authoritarianism. That's what happens in 1984. By the end of 1984, Winston Smith has to say 2 + 2 = 5. But not only does he have to say it, he believes it.
Yeah.
Even though he can see it's not true, right? So that is what I think is a key. That's why we know this movement is authoritarian in nature, because it invites you and demands, in fact, that you deny the observable reality before your eyes. And what that is a means of control. And that's what I find it very scary. So JK Rowling can publish a thorough, clear, compassionate statement of her views, and you can still say that her views are the opposite of that, because you've just decided that they are, and be expected to repeat that. It's quite unbelievable to me how many people, firstly, have bought into that, but also don't see the dangers of that kind of thing. I mean, it's so dangerous. I've even heard, I had it myself when I was on Sky News once doing the paper review, and the host said to me, well, JK Rowling has said all these things that have upset the trans community, these transphobic things, and I should have said, and I didn't, I thought afterwards, I should have said, well, what things?
Yeah.
That she hasn't, though. But I did say she hasn't. I said that's not the case. And it's not about, you must have got into arguments with people online about JK Rowling's transphobic. Now, she did it yesterday. So
yeah,
sometimes she replies to them. And a few days ago, she replied to someone who said that she keeps expressing hatred towards a whole community. And so JK Rowling said, well, can you give me a quote? Can you say where I've done that? And he said something like, I don't know where you've done that, but I bet you have. And wouldn't back down. And
it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's dangerous. Well, it's irresponsible. I don't know if you noticed, but I think a few days before that, possibly a week or so, BuzzFeed released an article and described her views as hateful and dangerous. And I tweeted the author of that piece on BuzzFeed, and he instantly blocked me. He didn't want to engage at all. So I think I wrote about it on Substack, and it picked up a bit of traction. And what they did on BuzzFeed is they just completely removed them two words, hateful and dangerous, from their opening paragraph. As if nothing had happened. Memory hold them words after they'd travelled the globe and gone in how many people's minds, not issued a retraction or a correction. So that's where we are now. They know they're not true if they've removed them. They know they're not on safe ground legally, but not enough to acknowledge it publicly, which is a very strange thing. I mean, it's BuzzFeed, isn't it? I shouldn't be expecting too much.
No, but isn't that concerning? Because they are still adults, and I talk in the book about how we are in an era of mass infantilism, and that's not how a fully socialized adult ought to behave. We all have to be surely capable of admitting when we are wrong. Surely, when the evidence is there in front of us. It's because, that's why I've borrowed that idea of the counter-enlightenment to describe this notion, because if you think the Enlightenment was a bad thing, and if you think evidence-led epistemology and rational discussion and basing your views on weighing up the facts is in of itself an oppressive force, then where are you you're just left in dabbling in fantasy, and the winner will be whoever can come up with the fantasy that dominates. And that's why we have this idea of lived experience and multiple truths and multiple ways of knowing, which is phrases that are now actually used by academics, people in higher education. I give the example of the New Zealand government bringing in indigenous ways of knowing into the science curricula. So even to the extent of raindrops are from a goddess. The raindrops are the tears of a goddess, right? And that is now being taught alongside actual science. And it doesn't make sense. And then one of the academics who complained about it, there was an open letter of people saying, look, while we respect indigenous beliefs and people's right to believe whatever they want and traditions and faith and all the rest of it, that stuff has no place in the science lesson, right? And that person got attacked and blacklisted and all sorts of horrendous stuff. I talk about it in the book, but...
Can't say blacklisted anymore.
Right, okay, well, they can't cancel me, Stephen, so I'm not really worried about that. But do you see what I mean, though? That we're we have to restore the primacy of truth over personal fantasies. I kind of feel like a really good way to understand this, I understand that anecdotal evidence can have some value insofar as if you've been through an experience that I haven't been through, I will be interested to hear about your account of that experience because there is something I can learn from that. I'm absolutely sure. But as you will know, what you can't do is take your particular experience of an event and extrapolate and say, this is how everything works. This is how the whole world works. I've been homophobically abused and attacked. I can't take those instances and say that means we live in a country where everyone is homophobic and there's a real systemic problem, because that will be wrong. I think a really good way for people to understand this, if they want to, if they're interested, is to watch Derren Brown's show, The System. Have you seen that one?
I don't think so.
Okay. You know who Derren Brown is, though? Yeah.
Yes.
And so he did a show called The System. And in this show, he basically creates a system whereby he can guarantee that you will win bets on a horse race, right? And it follows a woman through the whole hour, and he keeps feeding to her the winner of the next horse race. And each one is winning. Every time. It's impossible, right?
Yes.
And then he explains how he did it. And the reason why it works is because she can only see her own experience. She can't see the rest of it. I don't want to ruin it. I'm sure you can probably guess how he did it, but I don't want to ruin it. But by the end, you see the whole picture, and it's not just about one person's lived experience. If you just took her lived experience, you would think it was magical, that he had created this system which guarantees winners of a horse race. By the end of the show, you realise it's because we didn't have the bigger picture. So that's why we absolutely have to. We have to. I think it's one of his best, and we have to really avoid prioritizing lived experience. But the thing is, it's not just that we do that in discourse. We do it in law. I mean, the Crown Prosecution Service guidelines, the College of Policing guidelines, they're teaching our police officers to investigate and arrest people on the basis solely of the perception of someone else. So if someone says, if you say something to me now and I perceive it to be motivated by homophobia, as though I've got an insight into your soul, and then I go into the police, they will be obliged to contact you and question you about this. It's anecdotal evidence, lived experience. Okay, yeah. I draw the comparison with Salem in the book, because in Salem, all of the prosecutions were secured by this thing called spectral evidence. And what spectral evidence means is lived experience. It means the girl saying, we see witches. We see that person, we see her spirit coming out. No one else could see it, but that was their truth. That was their way of knowing. That was their lived experience. And that was sufficient to see people hanged from a tree. So what I'm saying is spectral evidence, lived experience, it's the same thing. It isn't, what I'm not saying is that people's personal experiences aren't valuable or cannot provide some kind of insight on occasion. What I'm saying is the police should not be arresting people on the basis of one person's perception of something that happened. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it's mental that you even had to say that last bit out loud, but that's where we are, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Yeah,
I know.
Well, Andrew, this has flown by. I truly love the book. I've always been a big fan of your writing. I've always enjoyed your articles, and this really has distilled the madness that's been taking place over the last several years, and it's broken down a lot of the theory that underpins it, the history, etc., where we are, where it's going, and lots of examples for people to draw upon whenever they're told this phenomenon doesn't exist. So that will be out when this conversation's out. It's out today, isn't it, in the real world?
The book is out today, and it's published today, and the thing is, if the culture wars don't exist, if all of this is, I couldn't have written the book, because the book is sort of so steeped in examples, and they're all sourced as well in the footnotes, so it's all there. So, yes, it exists, and we have to address it clearly, because we don't want things getting any worse than they already are.
Andrew, thank you very much. Always a pleasure. It's nice to see you as well, man. I hopefully get to spend some time in person this year.
It'd be great to see you. Yeah.